The wind had been blowing hard all morning, rattling the bare limbs of the cottonwoods, when I saw the shape of a rider ahead on the road. The figure moved slow, a dust cloud curling at the horse's hocks, each hoofbeat thudding against the packed dirt. By the time I reached the bend, the other rider had stopped waiting. He was a tall man in a long brown coat, the brim of his hat, shadowing eyes that didn't blink much. I didn't know then that before sundown, he'd be at my father's door, and by nightfall, I'd be riding away from everything I'd known. Before I tell you how it happened, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever seen a moment coming that you knew would change your whole life. My name is Lydia Crowell. I was born and raised on the edge of Copper Bend, where the soil is stingy and the wind carries grit into every crack. My mother died when Faye and I were still young, and from then on, we worked the place as best we could, patching roofs with scrap tin, mending clothes until they wouldn't hold a stitch. Pa wasn't a man for steady work. He knew horses well enough, and he could set a fence straight when he tried, but most of what he earned went to the saloon. That left Faye and me to keep the place from sliding into ruin. We grew up on the rules Ma left behind. You greet a neighbor before they greet you, you don't turn away someone hungry, and you never take what you can't pay for. Sunday meant boots brushed clean and quiet voices at the little clapboard church, even if the preacher's words didn't always stick with Pa. Our pantry was never full, but we made do. I could stretch a pound of beans into 3 suppers, and Faye could darn socks until they looked near new. We didn't have much use for coin, but we valued what it could buy in seed and cloth. Copper Bend wasn't much more than a dry goods store, a smithy, the saloon, and the sheriff's office. Folks came through now and then with money from the railroad or land deals, wearing coats finer than anything in our house. They had a way of talking like they already owned the ground they stood on. Men like that didn't notice girls like me, unless there was something they wanted. I learned early to keep my eyes level and my back straight no matter who was looking. By spring of this year, the well on our land had run near dry, and Pa struck some bargain with Silas Boone, a rancher a few miles east. I didn't know the details, only that sacks of feed showed up once, and water from the Boone place kept our mule alive through the last cold snap. Pa never said how he'd pay it back. Weeks turned into months, and nothing changed except the porch sagging more and the woodpile shrinking. I tried not to think about what he might promise when he had nothing left to give. That morning I was mending a tear in my only decent dress when I heard hooves out front. Pa stepped onto the porch, squinting against the sun, the smell of whiskey drifting from the doorway. The tall man in the brown coat sat his horse easy like he'd been riding all his life. They spoke low words carried off by the wind. Then Pa tilted his head toward the doorway, and I felt Faye stiffen beside me. He called us out, his voice flat. That was when I understood the debt wasn't going to be settled in coin. Pa's voice was sharp when he called us out, the kind of tone that didn't leave room for questions. Faye and I stepped into the light of the porch, the boards groaning under our weight. The man on the horse looked us over without shifting in the saddle. His eyes settled on me first, then on Faye, and I could feel my sister draw in close. Pa leaned his shoulder against the post, one hand still wrapped around the neck of his bottle. Silas Boone, he said, like the name ought to mean something to us. This here's Lydia, that's Faye. You take 'em the debt's square. Faye's breath caught beside me. I didn't move. Silas's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed low. I came for payment in coin or stock. Pa shook his head and took another drink, the liquor smell curling through the air. Coin's gone, stock's gone. But I got 2 daughters. Strong backs can work. He spoke like he was offering up a spare mule. Silas glanced at me, then at Faye. His eyes held steady on mine, and for a moment the air felt heavier. Like the whole place had gone still when he spoke again. It was measured. I'll take the older. Pa frowned, his lip curling. Take 'em both, get more for your trouble. Silas shook his head. I'm not buying anyone. He swung one leg over and stepped down from the horse. From inside his coat, he pulled a small roll of bills and held it out to Faye. There's a family in Bisbee, the Hardings. Tell them I sent you. They'll see you, right? Faye's eyes darted from him to me, her hands trembling as she took the money. Pa muttered something I couldn't hear and turned back toward the door. Silas nodded toward the road. Let's go. I hesitated, but there wasn't much to think over. Staying meant more of the same, or worse. I stepped down into the yard, the dust shifting under my boots, and climbed up behind him without waiting for his hand. We rode out without a word, the wind cutting across the flats and throwing grit into our faces. The land between Copper Bend and his place was open and dry, dotted with sage and the dark shapes of cattle far off. Faye's face stayed in my mind, the way she clutched the money, the way her shoulders had drawn in like she was bracing for a blow. I didn't know if she'd make it to Bisbee, but I hoped she would. By the time we reached the Boone Ranch, the sun had dropped low, painting the ridge behind the house in dull gold. The place was plain, but kept a corral with goats milling a chicken roost under a lean-to, a tool shed with a crooked door. He swung down first and untied a bedroll and a canvas sack from the saddle. I stepped down my legs, stiff from the ride, and took in the yard with a quick sweep marking the well, the shed's the fence line. You'll have the back room, he said. Door locks from the inside. Windows stick, but there's a chair if you want to wedge it. His eyes didn't meet mine when he added, You can leave when you want. I brought you here to keep you from worse, not to keep you. I didn't answer. Inside, the air smelled of coffee grounds and old wood. A square table sat near the stove, one chair pulled out as if waiting for someone. A shelf held a few books and ledgers, a rifle resting on pegs above the door. On the mantel, a photograph lay face down. He set his hat on a hook and lit a lamp before leading me to the back. The room was small, with a narrow bed, a wash basin, and a cracked mirror. A new bar had been fixed inside the door, 2 iron brackets sunk deep. My fingers traced the fresh wood. It was the sort of thing you put in for safety or for keeping someone in. There's stew on the stove, bread's yesterday's, well's 50 paces. He stepped back. If you want to ride out at first light, say so. I'll saddle the horse. When he left, I slid the bar in place and checked the window, pushing the sticky sash up and down until I knew its weight. Alone, my hands shook harder than they had on the ride. It wasn't until I'd washed my face in the cold water that I realized I'd been holding my breath most of the day. The lamp in the front room was turned low when I stepped out. A plate sat on the table with a spoon laid sideways across it. Silas had taken his own bowl to the porch, sitting with his back to the door facing the yard. I ate standing at first, then sat when the chair didn't bite. The stew was hot, and the warmth steadied me more than I expected. When he came back in, he spoke plain. I'll write the sheriff about Crowell. You can sign it or burn it. I won't send it without you. I asked why he hadn't done it before. Men like him don't stop at one try. I needed you out first. I thought about that for a while before saying, Write it, I'll decide after. He nodded and went to set a chair by the stove, the rifle within reach. That night, I slept with my boots on the floor and a kitchen knife under the pillow. The floor creaked once near midnight, and I held my breath until the sound stilled. By morning, the wind had shifted, carrying the smell of damp earth from somewhere far off. I found a cup of coffee waiting on the table, steam curling above it. Outside, Silas was at the shed, measuring and cutting a new hinge. I stepped down from the porch with the mug in hand and asked what he expected if I stayed. He didn't pause in his work. Eat sleep work if you want pay. Say if you're leaving so I don't wait supper. I asked about Faye. He said he'd telegraph the Hardings and go looking if she wasn't there. He didn't say it for show. By noon, he'd added a second chair at the table. I took the stew off the stove without him hovering, and he let me find the ladle and salt on my own. It was a small thing, but it sat different in my chest than any kindness I'd been shown in years. That evening, while he wrote the letter to the sheriff, I stood on the porch and watched the light fade over the ridge. I thought about the ride to town and the look the sheriff might give me. When Silas slid the finished letter across the table, I read it twice. It was clean and plain, naming what had been done and why I'd been taken from that place. "We send it," I said. He nodded once. The next morning would take us to Copper Bend to put my name in the sheriff's book. I didn't know yet how it would sit with me, but I knew I'd walk through the door on my own feet. The morning was sharp and clear when we set out for Copper Bend, the kind of cool that lingers in early spring before the sun climbs high enough to burn it off. Silas saddled the bay himself, checked the cinch twice, and handed me the reins without a word. I climbed up, settling my skirts, and he swung up behind me. The air smelled faintly of damp sage, and the road ahead stretched pale and empty between thin lines of fence. We rode steady, the hoofbeats, a slow rhythm against the hard-packed dirt. He let me guide the horse for a stretch, then took the reins when the trail narrowed between rock outcrops. By the time the first rooftops came into view, my stomach felt tight as a knotted rope. The town hadn't changed, same leaning fronts, same weathered paint, but walking in on my own terms was different than being sent. We tied off at the hitching post near the sheriff's office. The building was small, 2 rooms, with a flag drooping on the pole out front. Inside, Sheriff Amos Tully looked up from behind his desk. His vest was buttoned uneven, a hat hanging from the peg beside him. Recognition flickered across his face, but he didn't speak right away. I stepped forward and set the folded letter on his desk. He read it slowly, jaw tightening partway through. "You signed this?" he asked, looking up at me. I did. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You want to press charges?" I kept my voice even. "I want it written, filed. I want it not happening to the next girl," he nodded. "Once the kind of motion that settled things without a speech. We'll send a man for him before dusk. Can't promise how it'll hold if he denies it, but we'll try." Silas, who had been quiet at my side, spoke then. "We're not after revenge. Just making sure no one calls her gone again." The sheriff pulled a form from the drawer. "She needs to sign official, and I need a witness." Silas stepped forward. "Put my name down." I signed the pen, scratching across the paper. The sheriff stamped it and slid it into a folder marked with disputes and crimes. "You staying in town?" he asked. I shook my head. "I'm riding back." His gaze softened. "Hard place to go back to." I met his eyes. Better than where I came from. Outside, the street was bright with mid-morning sun. We mounted up this time with me taking the reins first. The wind lifted the brim of my hat as we passed the church and the dry goods store. Somewhere behind us, the jail cell door would be closing on my father before the day was out. We rode without hurry, trading the reins halfway home without a word. When we reached the ranch, I drew water from the well and brought it inside. Silas was at the stove cleaning out the firebox. We didn't talk about the ride until later, when we were both at the table. "You done almost don't," he said. I looked up from the mug in my hands. I'm not going to be quiet just because someone might look sideways. He nodded. "That's the only way it changes." That evening, I stayed in the front room after supper. We talked about the land, the stubborn goats, the way the wind could strip paint off a barn in one season. He listened without adding much, but I noticed he wasn't waiting for me to finish so he could talk over me. When I finally went to bed, I left the door unlocked. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Mornings started early with coffee on the table and work waiting outside. Silas showed me how to handle the goats, which rope to use for drawing water and where the feed was kept. He didn't hover or correct unless I asked. One afternoon, he fixed a second latch inside my window, where the old one stuck tapping the nails in place while I stood in the doorway. Late one morning, I was sweeping the front room when I opened a drawer for a rag and found a folded paper tucked between an oilcloth and an old sharpening stone. It was addressed to Sheriff Amos, dated 2 weeks before Silas came to the Crowell place. I read it once, then again. In it, he had written about the debt about my father, offering his daughters about me by name. He'd signed it, but never sent it. When he stepped in from the yard, dust still on his hands, I was holding the letter. "I found this," I said. He looked down at the floor for a moment before answering. "I wasn't sure you'd want it sent. Some folks think being named in a letter like that ties them to the shame. I didn't want to write your story for you." "You already did?" I said, though my voice wasn't sharp. He nodded. "Yeah. Just didn't sign it until I knew if you wanted it told." I folded the letter and held it out. "I want to take it to the sheriff." He studied me for a moment. "You sure I am now?" The next morning, I saddled the horse myself. Silas handed me a coat. "If the wind kicks up again, you'll want this." I swung up into the saddle. "I'll be back before dark." He asked if I wanted him to ride with me. I shook my head. "I want to do this alone." The road to town felt different riding by myself. I kept my eyes on the horizon, the weight of the letter in my pocket. By the time I reached Copper Bend, the sun was high. Sheriff Amos read the letter, signed the receipt, and tucked it into the same folder as before. "It's official now," he said. I made the ride home without stopping. The sun was touching the ridge when I came through the gate. Silas was in the yard, a hammer in his hand. I dismounted and set the folded receipt on the table inside. I made a statement, signed it, answered questions. He sat across from me. "You did something most wouldn't." I met his gaze. "You didn't either." That night the air was still. I stepped out to the edge of the property, following the rise behind the barn. Silas came 2 steps behind. The grave marker was simple initials, worn faint. "Caroline," I asked. He nodded. I didn't have much to give her, but space and peace. I tried to give that to anyone under my roof. I knelt and took the small silver ring from my pocket, pressing it into the dirt beside the stone. It wasn't mourning. It was thanks. We walked back without speaking. Inside, the fire burned steady. The chairs were side by side now, not across. I knew then the distance between us had closed, even if nothing had been said aloud. The days turned mild, the air carrying more warmth in the afternoons, and the mornings filling with the sound of water from the well and the low bleat of goats waiting to be fed. Work on the ranch had a rhythm now. Silas would be outside before sunup checking the fences or mending a hinge, and I'd join him once the coffee was poured. He showed me how to lift the pail without straining my back, how to keep feet away from the pushy goats that butted if you stood in the wrong spot. He didn't hover over me, and I learned the chores at my own pace. Inside the house, small changes took hold. A second chair stayed at the table now. I knew where the salt was kept, which ladle was for stew, and how the latch on the storeroom door needed a firm tug to close. One evening, after the tools were hung up, I offered to make biscuits. They came out uneven and browned a little too much on one side, but Silas ate them without a word of complaint. Later, as I was banking the fire, I noticed the door to my room had stayed ajar, not wide but enough to see into the hall. Not long after, while sweeping the kitchen, I came across the folded letter again, the one he had written weeks before arriving at the Crowell place. The paper was creased soft from being carried. Reading it a second time, I noticed the way he had described me, strong, proud, worn down but not broken. He had signed it, but never sent it, leaving the choice to me. When he came in from the yard, I held it out to him. "I've been thinking about this." He set his gloves on the table and leaned on the back of a chair. "It's yours to decide." I nodded. I already made that choice when I took it in yesterday. But I wanted you to know you were ready to do right before you even came for me. He didn't answer right away, just gave a small nod that seemed to close the matter. The next day, clouds moved in from the west, hanging low over the ridge. The smell of rain was faint, but steady. I was at the pump when he came from the barn, sleeves rolled to his elbows. "Fence line on the north pasture needs checking," he said. "You want to ride along?" I agreed, and we saddled the horses. The ground was soft from an earlier drizzle, and the air cool enough that I kept my coat buttoned. We worked our way along the fence line, Silas replacing a rotted post while I held the wire taut. The goats followed for a while, curious, before drifting back to the corral. At the last stretch, he tested the staples with the heel of his hand and stepped back. "That'll hold." I wiped a damp strand of hair from my face and looked out over the pasture. It felt different to be part of keeping something in good order, not just patching what was falling apart. On the way back, I told him I wanted to see Caroline's grave again. He didn't ask why, just turned his horse toward the rise behind the barn. The grass was wet enough to darken the leather of my boots when we stepped down. The stone was still plain, the initials worn almost smooth. I crouched and traced them with my fingertips. "I feel like she'd understand me," I said. He stood a little ways off, arms folded. "She would. Especially because of what you've been through." I asked if he still missed her. He looked out toward the far hills before answering. "I think I always will, but not the same way. It used to be like something torn open. Now it's quieter." I turned toward him. "And this, what about now?" His gaze met mine without wavering. "This is real. I didn't expect it, but I want it." The walk back to the house was slower than usual. The air felt thick with the things we'd just said. Inside, I hung my coat and set water to boil for coffee. He was by the stove laying kindling when I stepped closer. I rested my hand lightly against his chest and tilted my chin up. He didn't pull me in, just waited. When I leaned in, his mouth met mine, steady and warm. It wasn't rushed. His hand settled at my waist without tightening, and mine stayed at the front of his shirt, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. When we stepped apart, I told him, that was the first thing in my life that didn't feel like it cost me something. He brushed a loose strand of hair from my face and said, "It's not a debt. Not ever." That night, the chairs by the fire stayed side by side. I didn't close my door when I went to bed, and he didn't sit up in the front room with the rifle. The quiet between us was different now. Less guarded, more certain. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, but inside the house, it felt still. The first rain in months came hard and steady, rattling the roof and rolling in waves down the glass. It woke me before dawn, the sound unfamiliar after weeks of dry wind and brittle quiet. I stepped out barefoot, pulling a shawl tight, and found Silas in the kitchen with the fire coaxed back to life. He poured coffee into 2 tin mugs and set one in front of me. "Fire's holding," he said. We drank without much talk, the rain softening outside until it was little more than a steady patter. "Do you always get up when it rains?" I asked. He shrugged, eyes on the coals. "Old habit. Bad weather makes for bad memories. Easier to keep moving than lie still." His voice was even, but I could tell he meant it. I stood by the window, watching the water run down in crooked lines, and said quietly, "You've been alone a long time." He didn't look over. "Since the war. Then Caroline. Then nothing." I turned from the glass, then me. He didn't correct me. We sat at the table again, the smell of coffee and wood smoke between us. "I've been here weeks," I said. "You haven't once asked for anything." He leaned back, arms folded. "Wasn't your doing what happened before. I didn't bring you here to own you." The words sat heavy in the room, but they were steady. "If you stay, it has to be yours," he added. I held his gaze. "I feel like I do belong here. I just don't know what to call it." He said, "Call it yours when you're ready." By late morning, the rain had eased, leaving the ground dark and soft. We worked outside together, checking where the wind had knocked loose a fence rail. Silas measured and cut, while I held the posts steady. The goats pressed along the fence line, curious, and the damp air smelled of wet earth. We finished by midday, and when he set the hammer down, he said simply, "That'll hold." Walking back to the house, I matched my steps to his. "Do you ever think we're already living like we're married?" I asked. He didn't stop, but his eyes flicked toward me. "I think that every day." I nodded slowly. I don't need a preacher to tell me what I already know. I just need to know I'm free to go. He stopped, then facing me square. "You are. Always have been." I held his gaze. "And if I stay," his voice was low but sure, "then I'll spend every day showing you staying wasn't survival. It was yours to claim and mine to protect, not possess." Inside, the light was dim from the clouds. I set supper on the table, and we ate with the quiet ease of people used to each other's company. When I stood, I moved around the table to where he sat, resting my hand on his shoulder. He looked up, and I said softly, "Then I'll stay." He rose, and for a moment we just stood, the air between us closing. When he kissed me, it was slower than before. More certain, the kind of kiss that felt like it would hold through anything. That night, I didn't go back to my own room. We moved together quietly, the lamp turned low, our hands sure. There was no rush, no taking, only choosing. When I woke the next morning, the smell of him was in the blankets, and the sound of him moving came from the yard. I found one of his shirts on a hook, pulled it over my shoulders, and stepped into the kitchen barefoot. He came in brushing dust from his hands, looked at me the same way he had yesterday, and said, "Morning." I smiled. "I think I like this room better than the one I had." He nodded. "Then it's yours." Spring came slow but certain. The pasture greened along the edges, birds returned to the low trees, and the creek by the property line ran stronger. I built a narrow garden bed from scrap boards, with Silas's help planting herbs in neat rows. My dresses hung now in the shared room beside his shirts and work jeans. The house no longer felt like a place I might leave. Each week, when he went into town, I checked the mail. This time, a letter came addressed in the sheriff's hand. I held it until supper was done, then slid it across to Silas. He opened it, read it twice, and passed it back. Crowell had been convicted coercion, attempted sale of a person, unlawful settlement of debt, and sentenced to 5 years in Prescott. There would be no appeal. I stood and took down the old ledger from the shelf by the stove. My name was still there in the margin from the day Silas rode to Copper Bend with "taken for debt" written beside it. It had been crossed through with a single line, not erased. On the back page in his careful hand, it read, "Lydia resident, no debt owed, no price paid." I closed the book, feeling the weight of it in my hands. That night, with the fire burning low, I said the words first. "I want your name." Silas blinked once. "You sure?" I nodded. "I don't need a preacher to feel married, but I want it clear. I want to be seen for what I am, your wife." He stood and went to the small tin on the shelf, pulling out a folded paper. "I filed for the license last week," he said. "Wasn't going to press you. Figured we'd get to it when you were ready." I laughed once, quiet, and stepped into him. He caught me in an embrace, my forehead against his shoulder, and the sound of the wind outside seemed far away. Tomorrow, the sheriff and his wife would come to witness it under the cottonwoods by the ridge. The morning of our wedding broke clear and bright, the air cool enough that my breath showed when I stepped outside. The cottonwoods by the ridge moved gently in the breeze, their leaves catching the early sun. Silas was already in the yard, checking the hitching post where the sheriff's buggy would tie up. He looked up when he heard me on the porch and smiled. We had decided to keep it simple. Sheriff Alden and his wife Clara would stand as witnesses. I wore the same blue dress I'd mended a dozen times with my hair braided and pinned. Silas had on his cleanest shirt and the black vest he kept folded in a cedar box. By the time the sheriff's buggy came into sight, the coffee was ready, and the table held a plate of warm bread Clara had brought along. The sheriff read from the paper he'd brought, his voice steady and measured. Silas's hands were warm around mine, his grip neither loose nor tight, just enough to anchor me there. When the words were done, he leaned down and kissed me, not hurried, not showy, just enough for the moment to take root. Clara hugged me and the sheriff clapped Silas on the shoulder before they set off back toward town. We spent the rest of the day together on the ridge, watching the pasture spread out below, and the faint line of the creek winding away. It felt like the land had taken us in as much as we had claimed it. By evening, we were back inside supper, warming on the stove, the lamplight casting a soft glow over the room that was now ours. In the days that followed, the rhythm of work and rest didn't change much, though the way we moved through it had. My sewing basket stayed by the hearth. His boots rested by the door beside mine. We rode into town once a week for supplies, the trip quicker with two of us. Folks noticed. A few nodded, others kept their eyes fixed ahead. Word in a place like Copper Bend traveled without anyone speaking it aloud. It was on one of those trips that a letter came folded neat with my name written in an unfamiliar hand. I tucked it into my apron and didn't open it until we were back home. The paper inside carried the seal of the territorial court. Crowell had filed a petition claiming the conviction was unjust and naming Silas as someone who had unlawfully deprived him of property. The hearing was set for the next month. I read it twice before setting it down. Silas picked it up, scanning the lines with the same calm he always carried. "They're giving him another chance to talk," he said. I met his eyes. "What does that mean for us?" He folded the paper, sliding it back into its envelope. "It means we go to town when they call us, tell the truth, and come back here." Still, the weeks until the hearing carried a weight. Every rider passing on the road drew my attention. Each creak of the windmill made me glance toward the gate. At night, I lay awake longer than I used to, listening for sounds that never came. Silas didn't speak of it unless I did, but I could tell by the way he checked the latch on the door twice before turning in. When the day came, we left before sunrise, the wagon carrying us along the narrow road into town. The courthouse stood at the far end of Main Street, its windows catching the pale morning light. Inside, the benches were already half-full ranchers, tradesmen, women with baskets on their laps. Crowell sat at the table to the left, cleaner than I'd ever seen him, his hair combed back and a dark suit hanging loose on his frame. He didn't look at me once. The judge entered and the room settled. Crowell spoke first, his voice smooth, telling of debts unpaid and agreements broken. When my name came up, I kept my gaze steady, my hands folded in my lap. Then Silas was called. He stood straight, his words plain and without flourish, laying out each step from the day he found me to the day the sheriff took Crowell in. When it was my turn, I walked to the front, the wood floor cool under my boots. I told what I knew, each fact as it happened, leaving nothing to be guessed at. The room was quiet enough to hear the scrape of my boots when I stepped back. The judge spoke last, his voice leaving no space for question. The petition was denied. Crowell was to serve his sentence in full with no further appeal. A deputy stood by as he was led out, his eyes still fixed ahead, never once turning toward us. Outside, the air was warmer than it had been that morning. Silas helped me up into the wagon, and we rode out of town without stopping. The road home seemed longer, though I knew it wasn't. At the gate, he reached over and took my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles once before letting go. That evening, we sat by the fire, the letter from the court folded and tucked into the ledger beside the others. Neither of us spoke much, but the quiet felt different, less like waiting, more like closing a door. 3 days later, a rider came into view along the ridge at sundown, his figure cutting against the last light. He turned toward the house without hesitation, dust rising from the hooves. When he drew close, I could see the sealed envelope in his hand. The rider slowed as he reached the yard, dust settling over his hat brim and shoulders. He swung down from the saddle boots, hitting the ground with a thud, and held the sealed envelope out toward me. His face was lined from the sun, the skin weathered, but his eyes sharp. "Message from Judge Hanley," he said. "Told me to put it in your hand myself." I took it, feeling the weight of the paper before breaking the seal. The handwriting inside was neat, the words clear. The judge requested our presence in Copper Bend 3 days from now. A matter concerning Crowell's affairs had come up. Silas read over my shoulder, then folded the letter and slipped it into his vest pocket. "We'll go," he said simply. The next morning, we started early for town. The trail was quiet save for the steady creak of the wagon wheels and the soft clink of harness rings. Clouds hung low on the horizon, their edges tinged with gold from the rising sun. We passed 2 riders going the other way, each tipping their hats without slowing. Copper Bend was busier than usual when we arrived. A freight wagon stood outside the mercantile, and a group of men talked near the telegraph office. The courthouse windows caught the light just as they had the day of Crowell's hearing. Inside, Judge Hanley sat at his desk, a stack of papers before him. He motioned for us to take the 2 chairs across from him. "There's been a development," he said, resting his hands on the desk. "Crowell passed away in custody last week. No known kin came forward, and by law his remaining property must be settled." He slid a single folded paper toward Silas. "This deed was found among his effects. It names you both as inheritors, the cabin and the small plot behind it." Silas kept his eyes on the paper, his jaw tight. "We don't want anything from him," he said. The judge nodded once. "That's your choice, but you'll need to sign here either accepting or relinquishing it." I signed first, my hand steady, the pen scratching against the page. Silas signed after me, and the judge stamped it before placing it into a leather folio. When we stepped back outside, the air felt lighter, though the sky had grown overcast. We crossed the street to the post office, where the clerk handed me a thin parcel wrapped in brown paper. It was from Clara Alden. Inside, wrapped in a square of calico, was a small book of pressed flowers. A note slipped between the pages, read, "For your table a bit of summer to keep." We stopped by the smithy before leaving town. Silas needed a new shoe for one of the horses, and I watched as the smith's hammer struck the anvil, sending sparks into the air. The smell of hot iron mixed with the faint scent of rain on the wind. By the time the shoe was fitted, a light drizzle had started. The road home was slow going. The rain turned the dust to mud, and the wagon wheels cut deep ruts in the softer stretches. By the time we reached the ridge, the clouds were breaking, letting the last of the daylight spill across the pasture. We unharnessed the team in the quiet that follows a storm, the only sound the soft snort of the horses and the drip of water from the eaves. That night I placed Clara's book on the shelf by the hearth. Silas set the folded deed in the ledger, with the other papers, closing the cover without a word. The fire burned low, and the house felt as if it had settled deeper into its foundations. 2 mornings later, I was at the wash tub when the sound of hooves carried over the ridge. A rider came into view different from the last, younger, his coat dark with road dust. He reined in at the gate and called out, "Message from Sheriff Alden. He says it's urgent." Silas met him halfway, taking the envelope and glancing at the seal. He broke it open, his eyes scanning the page quickly. Then he looked up at me. "The sheriff wants us in town today. There's been trouble." Sheriff Alden was waiting on the boardwalk when we reached Copper Bend. His coat was damp from the morning mist, and his hat brim cast a shadow over his eyes. He motioned for us to follow him inside. The office smelled faintly of lamp oil and dust. A small fire burned in the stove, though the room still held a chill. On the desk lay a ledger and a folded map. The sheriff tapped the map with one finger. Last night, he began, someone tried to set fire to the old Crowell place. We caught him before it took, but he's in the cell now. Says he was hired. Silas leaned closer. Hired by who? The sheriff's gaze stayed steady. By a man from out of town. Name's Bartlett. Seems he had a grudge over a debt Crowell never paid. Thought burning the place might flush out whatever was left there. The sheriff unlocked the back door, and we stepped into the dim corridor. In the last cell, a wiry fellow sat on the bench, hat in his hands. He didn't meet our eyes. The sheriff's voice stayed even. He'll answer to the judge when the circuit comes through. I just thought you ought to know. We left without speaking much. Outside, the clouds were breaking apart, strips of blue showing through. Silas paused by the hitch rail. That land's ours now, whether we wanted it or not, he said. Maybe it's time we decide what to do with it. 2 weeks later, with the help of a few neighbors, the old cabin was taken down. The boards that could be salvaged went to mend barns and build chicken coops. The rest was burned in a clean, steady fire. By sundown, the clearing was empty, save for the oak trees and the smell of fresh ash. In spring, we planted the ground with corn. The soil, once neglected, took the seed well, and by midsummer the stalks stood taller than my shoulder. Clara Alden came by with a basket of biscuits and honey, and we sat in the shade watching the wind move through the rows. Life settled back into its rhythm chores at dawn evenings, by the hearth, the sound of the night wind through the shutters. The weight that had hung over us since Crowell first rode into our lives was gone, replaced by a steady, quiet peace. Out here, the land keeps its own kind of justice. It doesn't rush, but it doesn't forget. We'd been tried in its court by hardship, by fear, by the hands of others, and we'd come through with our place intact. If there's one thing the frontier teaches, it's that family isn't just the ones you're born to. Sometimes it's the people who ride through the storm with you, who steady your hand when the ground shifts. Those are the ones worth keeping close. Thank you for riding this trail with me. If this story's found a place in your heart, share it with someone who might need to hear it. There's always room at the fire for one more.